the wrong link. I can see number 4. I can't find number 5.
It's the same link.
Oh, it's the same link.
Yeah.
It's just the title say Angular Online Event number 4. Can't find number 5.
It's the
same link.
1 second.
Yeah. Just the title say Angular Online Event number 4.
Yeah.
Find number 5.
It's this. 1 second.
Can you send me the link?
Yeah. It's this. 1 second.
Can you send me the link?
Yeah, 1 second.
Make sure you hear me through Zoom.
Yeah,
so,
I can hear you.
So it won't be any delays. Yeah, if you
we are online, so
I'm just looking for the link.
Yeah,
so, and I can't find it.
Moment.
You can send it on WhatsApp.
Okay. Okay, hello. We are online with Nir. Nir, can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can hear.
Okay, perfect. So let's start the 5th event, Angular Online event. Today we have 2 special guests. First is Nir Kaufman with Dependency Injection. And second is Minko Gechev, and with Minko we have a Q&A session. So please write in the chat. You can hear us, you can see us, and we can start the meetup. Okay.
Hello.
Hello, hey Minko.
Hello, Minko.
Hey, how are you?
Thank you. Nice to see you guys. Okay, so now once again, we can start the next Angular Online meetup. Nir Kaufman, you are first, so the stage is yours. Have fun.
Thank you, Derek. Today, we're going to continue a series that I recently started, which is the Angular Martial Arts series. If you haven't seen it before, you can search YouTube. You can see one of my students dressed as a ninja. Today, I decided to come and talk about deadly dependency injection patterns. It's not deadly in means of it can risk your life, obviously, but it is deadly because if you master this technique, you can do stuff that make the code shiver. This is called TAC1D. And let's get started. So I've prepared this tiny demo app, which basically doesn't do too much. But if I click this button, I'm gonna make an API call, which is gonna resolve the 200. Hopefully you can see it. Let me make it a little bit larger. And I can generate a 404. And I can generate a 500 request. And here it's a button that doesn't do anything. So this is our stage for today. And I want to share with you a dependency injection technique that I use a lot. that enable me basically to implement few of the ideas that I've taken from the solid principle. If you're familiar with the solid principle, is one of the, I think, the most popular object-oriented design principle. I don't want to get too much deep into the theory because I believe of keeping everything practical. So let me just start coding and explaining what I'm trying to achieve. And at the end of this demo, I will connect it to the actual solid principles. So that's the code. Currently, I've got only one component, the app component, which, like I said, doesn't do too much. I've got few buttons, each one of them using this tiny library, making an API request and getting status back. I'm using this HTTP stat, which is a great website if you want to test different responses from the server anyway. The feature that I'm going to implement from scratch is going to be some kind of a central alert or messages feature, which basically can catch errors through an interceptor or just show general UI messages that you might want to display from time to time. And like always, I'm going to start with creating a new Angular module. Let's call this messages, or you know what, alerts. And there's a good reason, because a lot of people asking, what are the reason to create a separate module in Angular? Specifically those days with Angular 9, that for in some use cases, we can omit the model. But for me, Angular modules, it's much more than just, a dependency injection container. It's a way to organize my code in a specific way that I find very useful. And hopefully by the end of this demo, you will totally understand why I decided to take this tiny feature and create a dedicated module for it. So I created this alert module on a separate folder. And the way that I like to work with Angular, recently I came up with this term out of nowhere, which is the provider-oriented development. It's just a way that I like to teach, especially new developers who started to use the framework, which basically means that when I try to implement a feature, I'm always started by creating a service, a provider, a simple class that holds the logic, and then use other Angular component in order to consume this logic and connect this logic to different parts of my application. It can be a component, it can be a guard, it can be a pipe, it can be an interceptor, like in this example, but everything starts for me with creating a provider, which holds the logic. So I'm gonna call this provider alert. And because I'm using the Angular CLI, I'm gonna get the suffix alert service. Let me make it a little bit larger. And on this alert service, I'm going to create a few private properties. One of them going to be messages, or you know what, let's just call it alerts, which is going to be a behavior subject that's going to contain an array of alerts, alert, which I haven't defined yet. I can create an interface real fast. Let's say that alert currently just got some text. So that's going to be a private behavior subject. I'm going to create a private alerts queue. It's just going to be an empty array. And let's just change it. Let's call this an alert queue. And finally, I'm going to expose the read-only alerts observable, which going to resolve into alert array. So I decided to start by live coding this part of the service because it's kind of a common pattern recently to create a service which use behavior subject and expose a read-only observable, which is like you're going to see in a second, going to be taking this behavior subject and exposed it as an observable. And these techniques enable me very easily. Let me paste some code here and change the naming. That's going to be this alerts queue, this alerts the behavior subject, and this alerts, which is the behavior subject as an observable. This way I don't expose the behavior subject. I'm just exposing this alert observable where I can emit events and connect it to my reactive UI. This service gonna contain, for now, let's just implement just one method, which is set alert, which is gonna take an alert as an argument. And the only thing that I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take this alert, push it into my alert queue, and then I'm gonna call alerts behavior observable next, sending away this alert queue. So this method gonna take an alert. I'm gonna maintain my own internal array, which is not that important for this example, but it's a nice pattern that got some very good reasons behind it that I'm gonna share later on. And this is the most important line. I'm calling next on the behavior subject. I'm pushing this alert queue, this new alert queue with this new alert in it, which is exposed and as an observable. So now I can create a component that can consume it. So I'm done with the service. I've got the provider in place, and I can start go on and connect this service to different Angular components. And when I say components, is not just mean, I'm not just mean like UI components. It can be, like I said before, interceptors or other services. In my use case, I will start with a component. So I'm going to create an Angular component. Again, I'm using the same name, alert. So now I've got an alert component, as you can see right here. And this alert component, we're going to do something very simple as a starter. ng container, ng4. And for every alert of alerts, which is async, what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to use Bootstrap to create a nice alert danger. And right here, let's take the alert text and show it. Remember here, I've got an interface called alert, and I've got text. Next, this component gonna inject our alert service. And gonna expose alerts observable from this service. Actually, I don't even need to do this. I can just do alert service alerts. Let's do this. Public and we've got everything in place. So this tiny reactive component doing something very, very, very simple, injecting the alert service where all of our logic is implemented, assigning an alert observable from this service. Some people like to inject the service and bind it directly to the template. I don't like to do it for a lot of reasons. I like to keep all of my injection private and just expose to the template whatever I want to expose, and usually integrate it with the component lifecycle methods. So I won't get into a situation where my alert, where my provider, my service provider, updating a value on the template and I'm getting some kind of a race condition, or the famous value was changed after the component was checked. So this component gonna take this alert from the service and it's gonna run with an ng4 and show those alerts. But that's not enough. I also want to be able to create or set alerts within different places in my app. So for this module, I'm gonna create an interceptor. Let's call this interceptor API error. My interceptor, exactly like the alert component, gonna inject the alert service. Because everything is around the provider. That's the reason I'm always start with the provider implementing the logic, and then, like I said, connect it to different components in the framework. So this interceptor, I wanted to catch API errors and use this alert service in order to display an alert. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna paste some code because I don't wanna waste too much time on the implementation, but I'm going to go step by step and show you exactly what's going on here. And let me just import everything I need. All right. So this interceptor gonna intercept all the HTTP requests. Let me just get rid of this, saying here rec, but that's actually a request. But I care about the response. So this is a very common implementation of calling next, calling the request, and then pipe a catch error. So if something went wrong with my API request, I can catch an error and use the alert service in order to set an alert and push this object. Again, let's not focus about the actual implementation because that's not the important part of this demo. Obviously, you can write, I'm sure you can come up with a better implementation of how you can catch specific errors, how you can handle different kind of errors. Same for the service itself. But if I go back to the concept, so we started with the provider because everything is around the provider. This is the provider-oriented Angular approach. I started with creating this provider, which contains the logic, and then a component that consume this provider and use it in order to display the alerts, and then an interceptor that consume this provider and use the set alert method in order to push a new alert, and everything packed together nicely inside this module. So currently this module is declared the alert component, which I'm gonna export. I'm gonna register my alert service right here. And I think we kind of okay with this. We can try to use our, oh, wait a second, I forgot to register the interceptor. So let me come here to my providers. And use the HTTP interceptors injection token and use this class, which is our API error interceptor. Not forgetting to mention that this is a multi-injector. We're going to write one of these by our own in a second. So let's look of what we did up until now. We've got a nice module that packed together a provider, a component, an interceptor, and now I can go back to my app module. And that's the nice thing about Angular, that all I need to do right now, hopefully, unless I missed something, is take my alert module. And if I want to use the component, I'm going to use my alert component as part of my bootstrap components, because what I want to do, I want to go to my index.html and I want to use it right here. And that's, by the way, that's a question that I get a lot, because in a lot of my demos, I am creating more than one bootstrap component. And sometimes I get these questions, why and what's the benefits of this? Well, this is a plain HTML file. Actually, you can write here a bunch of static markup that's going to be rendered right away. The part of where Angular is starting to use JavaScript to render the contents happens within this element, the app root. So it's totally okay to create more than one bootstrap component if you want to render another root in your index.html. And it's totally okay to add some extra HTML here if you want to get something shown on the screen until Angular is loading. You can also put some content here like loading, which is going to disappear once Angular started to run. So a lot of times we use this to get a better user experience without too much effort, just creating a lot of static markup and let Angular render whatever it needs. So I put my NK alert right here beside the app root. In the future, I might add some CSS and I want to align it against the body, but that's not the point. Let's go back to our app component and try to see if we can get something. Going back to the browser, I'm going to try to generate a 500, and we get a nice alert right here. So that was the basic. And up until now, everything looks good and everything works as expected. And we kind of get the full experience of Angular, how we can use dependency injection and features like interceptors and reactive components wrapped in the module. And all we need to do is just drop this module into our app module and get this feature done. Obviously, if I just remove it, I'm using this component, I'm not rendering it dynamically, so I will get an error, but I've got everything nice, packed and isolated inside this module. So we can stop right here, but now I want to show you how I implement a principle called the Openclosed Principle, which I took from these solid principles. And like I told you, I won't get into theory at all. I'm going to implement the feature, explain the motivation, and then connect it to the theory. Generally speaking, I would like to be able to add some custom logic or to extend the behavior of what's going on inside this module, but without touching the source code of this module. In other words, I want to create some kind of a mechanism which enable me to add logic to the module without touching it. Every module should be able to be open for extension, but closed for modification. That's, I think, if I remember right, the definition of this principle. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to go back to my alert module, and I'm going to create an injection token. I'm going to call this token alert loggers. I'm going to use the new injection token. And this injection token, let's, yeah, you know what? For now, I'm going to say any array, but I'm going to change it in a second. So don't worry. I don't even need to do something here, but let's leave it like it's any for a second. I'm going to call it an alert logger. And now I've got an injection token that I can work with. What's the point behind it? Well, let me take it to a separate file, what I was intended to do anyway. I'm going to create another file. I'm going to call this file alert types, because I can think of something better right now. It's going to contain this token. And remember that I told you that I'm going to replace this any. I want this injection token to contain, to be binded to a specific interface. It's easier to me to explain with code and then explain with words. So I'm going to create an interface called alert logger. And this interface, the alert logger, gonna have only one method, which is log, that's gonna take whatever. Let's say it's gonna take an alert, because we've got an interface for this. So you're gonna take an alert. And it's not gonna return anything. So this injection token gonna be an array of anything that can that will implement the alert logger. But up until now, we didn't wrote any logic at all, which is part of the idea that I'm trying to show you, which is let's create interfaces, let's create abstract injection token, let's not deal with implementation until we're gonna have to do it. So let's talk a little bit about this injection token. Remember that when I created the interceptor and you're seeing this all around, I register my interceptor under a built-in injection token that came from Angular called HTTP interceptor. So in a way, I was able to add my own logic into something that it's built in inside of Angular. And this is exactly what I'm trying to achieve right now. Just like I was able to add my own interceptor and run this logic as part of a black box, a module that came from Angular without the need to go into the source code or change something or hack something, I want to use this message, this alert logger multi-injection to do basically the same thing. So I'm going to go back to my service. And I'm going to use dependency injection. But now I'm going to inject my alert loggers multi-injector. I'm going to mark it as optional because I don't want it to crash if it's not available. And that's hopefully going to give me an array of message loggers. So that's going to be an alert where is my alert logger? Let's go to type and don't forget to export stuff because otherwise you can't reach it from nowhere. So that's going to be alert logger array. All right. And again, look carefully. Now I've got a service, a component, whatever, a piece of code where I inject something that is not yet exist. And one of the reasons that I make this optional is because I want it to be optional. Second, it's 100% abstract. Is using a token, just a token that doesn't have any implementation associated with it yet. And I define the type as an array of an interface. So it's not a concrete implementation yet. But because everything is binded to an interface and I've got dependency injection mechanism, now I can go ahead and I can write some log. For example, every time you set an alert, I can go ahead and check if this loggers, it's supposed to be an array. So let's do something simple, because sometimes the most simple form of code, it's the best code that you can write. Recently I started to take a step back from writing what I call like fancy JavaScript and try to be as simple as possible. So if I'm expecting to get an array of loggers, I can check if this thing is null, and I can also check if the length, if I've got loggers, and if the length is more than one, it means that I've got an array of loggers. And if I've got an array of loggers, I can loop over them. And for each one of the logger, I'm just going to call logger dot log. And I'm going to stop right here. We've got like a few minutes to complete this demo, specifically this demo, and talk about it. But let's go through the code real quick. So the first step was to create an injection token. It's just a token. There is no implementation. It's something that I can work with, that I can register, use it as a key to register my own logic. I created an injection token, a valid injection token. That's the reason I used the new injection token. You can't use whatever you want. You can't just declare a constant and hope that that's going to work. Next, I defined an interface. If you're going to write your own logic, your own loggers, you have to obey to this interface, because when I implemented my own logic, my internal logic, this alert service, I gave you the option to extend it with logging capability, but I rely on a specific interface. So now you can write your own loggers under this key, and my code gonna accept those loggers to be of type alert logger. And every time someone set an alert, I can run and use this logger service all around. Let's see how we can actually make it work. So the nice thing about it now is that if I did everything okay, I can go to my app module, and without touching the alert module, I want to try to add my own custom logging functionality to this alert module. For this, I'm going to create an array of providers. And I'm going to use this injection token that I created before, which is alert loggers. I'm going to add my own implementation. Let me create a class called cool logger, or just, you know what? Let's make it crystal clear. Custom logger. I've got a feeling of a typo. And I'm going to implement the alert. Come on, the alert logger interface. Now I have to implement my log, which is going to get an alert. And let's bring something back from the 90s and do a real alert. I don't think that's going to work. I'm just going to do a console log, my custom logger. I'm consistent with my typos, which is good. Consistency, it's very important. Alert, text. So here I've got my own logic that I created within the app module context. And within the app module, I'm using this key that was provided from the alert module, which enable me right now to assign my own logic. I'm using the multi-true because I want to make sure that I can add some extra logger to this multi-provider. And let's give it a try. Let's see what's gonna happen. So let's generate 404. And almost. I think I did something bad because I can't see my log. So let me check real quick where I messed up. So I've got alert loggers, I've got my custom logger, I've got it multi-true. I think it's just a matter of giving it a nice real refresh. Let's see if I write. No. So I've got my alert loggers, which are provided right here in providers. I've got my alert module. I can go ahead to my alert module and check my service, my alert service. And let's see what's up here. I'm injecting the alert loggers. I've got an array of loggers, hopefully. And if the length, and I've got it and it's more than one, let's do a quick debugger here. And don't worry, if that's not gonna work, I'm not gonna waste your time. We're gonna see a working demo that I prepare ahead for those kind of situations. And here's the debugger. And this loggers is undefined. I wasn't able to fulfill my promise and show you a working example, but I'm gonna dedicate like 5 seconds to it. If that's not gonna work, I'm gonna launch the demo that I prepared as a backup before the talk. Let's see why. Inject alert loggers, which is optional, private loggers. And let's go to the alerts module and see if I did anything wrong here. Doesn't seem like this. The last thing I'm gonna do is just make sure that I don't have any local out of sync environment. Meanwhile, I'm gonna go back to my app module and I'm gonna check it again. Providers, I'm providing the alert logger. I'm using this class, custom logger right here. It's got the log. I'm using multi-true. And let's try before we, oh, sorry. That wasn't my intention. That was me accidentally stop sharing my screen. Right? Let me try to generate a 404. I hit the debugger again, and our loggers are undefined. Right. So I'm doing the same mistake again and again and again. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to show you the example working in live coding, but that's part of live coding. So let me quickly go back to the code and let's close this project. And I'm gonna open up the backup demo that I prepared just before the meetup in case that live coding goes wrong. And I'll go back to my workshops, to the Angular martial arts, to the this project. Let's go with this window. And let me quickly do an ng serve to the ta1d. Let's a second. Condition of the logger should be length. Oh, yes. You're smarter than me. That's for sure. Yeah, let's go back to the TAC1D. Someone actually catch my mistake and let's fix it. Appears that I just missed something very, very important. You see this condition? If this logger's length is more than 1, don't do anything. Well, we've got 1 logger, so it should be more than 0. So now, hopefully, if we go back to the project, where are we? Here we are. Let's refresh. Let's open up the console. Let's try to generate an error and see what's going to happen. Debugger, These loggers are still undefined. So I'm not sure it was the problem. I probably missed something. So let me go back to working demo and we summarize and end up this session. So Angular conc view. And we're gonna ng serve tac1d. This is a working example that I prepared for you in order to share it on GitHub. So you can see here under app, here I didn't call it an alert, I call it a central message, but the concept is the same concept. You see right here that I can create my own custom loggers, message loggers, and using this multi-provider key in order to add my functionality and extend the central message module, which internally got a service which, where are you? That's not the right one, which internally got a service that inject the loggers, exactly the same code that I wrote right now with you. I just messed up with something. And the same condition apply right here. If the length is 0, go ahead and call these loggers. Let's check it out. Cool. So I'm going to generate a 404. That's not my lucky day, I can tell you this. Sometimes you've got everything working and sometimes you don't. Actually, I know exactly what's going on here. Because this demo took this whole thing like a step forward. So there is another service here that config this entire thing to not log. So let me fix it because I don't want to let it go before you can see it actually working, because otherwise you're not gonna believe me. So central message, the message service that I created. Configuration, I'm gonna remove this piece of code right here, leaving it just like I show you. When you set message, you go over the loggers, and for each logger, you log a message. And finally, hopefully, let's generate a 404. And here you go. So let me summarize. Also, the live demo wasn't like a wow show. That's the thing. When we build modules like these central message modules, and if we like to be able, which is considered to be a good practice, which actually considered to be one of the most famous best practices because it's one of those solid principles, the open-closed principle. When we design a module or every piece of code, but specifically an Angular module, and we like to write our code in a way that enable us to add custom logic and extend the behavior of the model without the need to go ahead and modify the source code using dependency injection and multi-providers, that's the Angular way to achieve it. Angular uses the same technique all over the place. When we create validators, when we create forms, when we initialize it into the Angular bootstrap process, when we build our own interceptors. The way to achieve this, though, is to create a token like these message loggers, and then in our service, use dependency injection, inject this token. And if you edit any logic or any class to this array of loggers in this example, we can interact with our code with this module without touching it. So I'm going to share this entire code with you, and I'm going to answer some questions if you've got some. And if you're gonna get some more question after this session is done, because Minko gonna be right here, you are more than welcome to write it in the comment, and I add some more explanations. But hopefully, this entire approach show you how to achieve the same behavior that we get from Angular that enable us to use multi injectors or a token that can use as a key to register more than one class, but eventually enable us to achieve this open close principle, which says in simple English, I can extend and add my own logic like these custom loggers into an external module without the need to modify the code of this module itself. So someone asked, is the same thing like the HTTP interceptor? Yeah, that's the same thing. It's same thing like the form module. Use the same thing. When you create a new form control, you register your form control under the value accessor multi-injection. In Angular, we've got several places where this multi-injection become handy. One of them, for example, if you want to take it a step further, as if you look at the example that I sent you, we've got a multi-provider called app initializers. So I can add my own code that's gonna run with Angular gonna initialize. So guys, let me summarize. The most important thing, the one and only thing that I want you to take from this example, even if the demo was too fast or eventually wasn't working because I probably missed something somewhere, that's not the point. The point is that when you are building your Angular modules, when you're building your own logic, always keep in mind, how can I implement this principle of open close? How can I write my Angular module in a way that I enable myself and others to add custom behavior, add some custom logic, extend how my module behave without the need to modify the code within the module itself. Using dependency injection, we can achieve this kind of easily with Angular. Of course, we can take it a step forward, but it is important to me on these sessions to focus on multi-providers and how we can actually write code that interact with this. So I think that that's it for today, because otherwise I can go ahead and talk for hours and show you some more examples and more examples. I'm going to share the link to the working example in the comment of these videos. If you want to see some more, if you got any more questions, first of all, download the GitHub repo where you found the working example. I added a lot of comments because I've shown you not just how to use multi providers, these multi providers features, but also how to write your entire module based on abstract classes and how to use dependency injection and write your entire feature against interfaces and not a concrete implementation. So check out the Git repo, and I'm always available. Most of you already know this was my first time in this meetup. So hit me with emails, tweet me. I'm answer everyone, and I will be more than happy to extend and share some more practical techniques on this topic or anything else related to Angular, obviously, not how to grow a white beard. So I think that I talked too much, and yeah, Derek, take control.
Okay, Nir, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this great presentation with a lot of meat. So, big applause for Nir. And now the stage is your, Minko. So I've sent you a few questions we have from some participants from last time, and we can use it, and we have some question on our chat. So the stage is yours. Nir, thank you so much. Minko, have
Thank
fun.
you.
We can't hear you.
Oh yeah, I was muted.
Oh,
Okay, it should be fine now. Yeah, I got about 18 questions already. So I hope that you would be curious to hear their answers as well. So in general, I grouped the questions in like a couple of different categories. One of them is related, one of the categories is related in particular to change detection and runtime performance. There is a category related to mostly initial load time performance. There is an HTTP category, and yeah, a couple of. Do you still hear me actually? Let me, yeah, okay, Zoom is here. Zoom disappeared on some reason, so I thought that it crashed or something. And a couple of other categories that are contain pretty random, like pretty unrelated questions. It's like the utils directory in a project. You never want to have it, but once in a while you do. So the first question is how to manage change detection to avoid unnecessary performance issues. The general techniques to optimize the runtime performance of any Angular application in general are to avoid change detection. And you can avoid change detection in a couple of different ways. Probably the most popular way is to use on-push change detection. Now, if you imagine that the entire component, the entire application is just one large component tree where the individual components are nested in one another, the on-push change detection allows you to skip entire component subtrees. So the Angular change detection is going to, in general, traverse each one of these components in the component tree and evaluate their bindings, evaluate the expressions inside of their templates. So if you have very heavy bindings in any of your components, or you have large amount of components with lightweight bindings, Angular change detection might not be able to fit into 16 milliseconds, and you may experience some performance issues. You may experience lag, drop of frames in your browser. So what you can do is just not perform change detection when you don't have to. With on-push, as I mentioned, you can skip change detection in entire component subtrees. In general, with on-push, you can say, I don't want to run change detection in this particular component subtree with root, the given component that we're applying on push to. I want to run change detection only if this component receives some inputs that have different value when performed referential check. So when we compare the values with two times equal. Yeah, so I would recommend you to use on-push change detection. Aside from that, you can cache some of the bindings. So if you are recomputing the same value all over again, this is probably redundant, and you can save Angular some time if you cache the binding somehow, cache the result, and directly provide it instead of recomputing it from scratch. Pure pipes can be helpful there, and many other techniques. I've actually written a lot about this topic, so I can share some further resources in the chat in a bit. The second question is, how much does the binding to functions in HTML slow down the app? Yeah, it depends. It depends entirely on your bindings. If in your bindings you're calculating whether a certain number is prime, for example, or not, this could be quite a heavy computation on large numbers. So this is probably going to be a slow binding. But if in your binding you have just bound to a property, and this property has a particular value that Angular just displays in the user interface, then this binding is very, very cheap. So if you have very cheap bindings and not too many components, very likely your application is just going to run fine. If you have large amounts of components, like thousands of components on your page, and in each one of these components you have very lightweight bindings, it's very likely that your application may start to struggle at certain points, especially on low-end devices. So in these cases, I'll just recommend you to use on-push. There is a question also how to improve performance on Internet Explorer browser. It's pretty much the same as you would optimize performance on any other browser. So not too much of a difference. Maybe the Internet Explorer's JavaScript virtual machine is not as powerful as what you would see in places like like Chrome or like SpiderMonkey in Firefox. But in general, the techniques are pretty similar. The differences are going to be mostly in parse time. So probably in Internet Explorer, the JavaScript virtual machine is going to be much slower when parsing your JavaScript. So this can make your initial load time worse. So in this case, you just have to delay some JavaScript. What you're not immediately using on the page, you can just lazy load it. And this way, Internet Explorer is not going to like choke with a large bundle. Yeah, there is a question also. Should we apply on push on everything or on some of your components? I would in general not recommend you to use on push unless you see some performance issues. So there is this very interesting trade-off of optimizing a little bit too early. And even if the optimization is something very tiny, something like, let's say you're iterating over a collection of items and at certain points you break and you don't document this well, your colleagues might be wondering, why are you breaking in this loop? Like, is there anything particular? Like, why this condition means that you can stop iterating over the collection? So over optimizing at certain point can make your source code harder to read. On push is the same thing. With on push, you're bringing some extra semantics on top of your source code. So junior developers who are not used to Ganger's change detection, they could be a little bit confused. And if you don't really need to optimize, if your application is working really fine, you don't really need to use on push at all. On push, I would recommend you to use only when you perform really heavy computations in given component subtree. Then you can directly skip this subtree, and Angular would not have to check it that frequently. And why on push is not the default change detection strategy is another question. Yeah, actually, I can share my screen. It might be a better idea, so you can see the questions as well. Here is. So here we're on this question. Why on push is not the default change detection strategy? That's mostly for development experience. With on push, things are getting a little bit more complicated. As I said, the change detection has slightly more complicated semantics. So you need to think about this slightly more complicated semantics. And on top of that, changes would not be necessarily propagated in components which have on push change detection. So this, and in most applications, definitely on push is like change detection is not a concern. So that's why on push is not the default one. Yeah, the next question is on push, track by how proper and best way to use it. About on push, we already talked a lot. Track by. So, okay, I can explain what track by does exactly. I'm also going to link to some resources for further reading. In general, imagine we are iterating over a collection of users. And we are using ng4 for the purpose. So ng4 needs a way to find out which users in the collection have changed between different runs of the Angular change detection. So we run the change detection once and we render the list of users. Now, at the second iteration of the change detection, we run it again. And at this point, we need to find which user has changed. So usually what track by uses by default is just to compare the individual users with equality check. And this works really well. But imagine you create a new user object. And you haven't changed this object at all. I mean, you haven't changed the entity at all. In this case, Angular shouldn't really re-render this list item because you haven't changed its identity at all. You have just changed the object which represents this entity. In this case, the equality check is not the best way to compare items, because equal is going to return false. And well, we didn't change the entity, so we don't really want to re-render it. In this case, you can use the track by function, and you can track the users by their ID. So this way, if you have user with ID 1 that you have rendered once, on the second iteration of the change detection, you're not going to re-render this entity. Instead, you're just going to find out that it has the same ID as in the previous iteration, and you're going to leave it unchanged. So track by is extremely convenient when you're using such immutable data structures, where multiple objects can point to the same business entity, to the same user in our example. I'm going to still link to resources for further reference because it might not be really obvious. It's really interesting problem though. If you look very abstractly across different frameworks, you're going to see that pretty much all frameworks have the same solution. In all frameworks, when we're iterating over a collection, we want to have keys for the individual items in this collection. By default, Angular fallbacks to using the identity of the object, the reference of the object as a key, but you can also specify an alternative key, such as the ID. It's a really interesting problem. So what are the best reactive patterns that help working with on-push change detection? That's a very generic question. I'm not sure whether I can give a very specific answer. Very reactive, very popular reactive patterns right now for managing, for like architectural patterns for user interface are NGRX in general. It's probably the most popular one. And it works well with on-push. So you can feel free to give it a try. The next question is what tools to use and how to use them to profile JavaScript in Angular web apps. Chrome DevTools is really the best thing that you can use. Firefox DevTools, they work really well as well. I'm not as experienced in them. The good news is that in the team, we're working on a guide right now on how to profile Angular applications. Exactly how much memory your application consumes. We're primarily going to focus on rendering performance, so we're going to cover this CPU time. For network, for performance in general, initial rendering as well, I would recommend you to use Lighthouse as well. It is already built into Chrome DevTools. And if you want to perform a more environment-independent benchmark, you can use Web Page Test. Web Page Test is a really nice service that allows you to run benchmarks across different real devices. And it's not going to depend on your particular internet connection because Web Page Test is going to run the benchmark somewhere in the cloud. We have one more question on how to manage modules to keep apps smallest as possible. So this is mostly related to, modules, how do you, there are different people who think about modules differently. Some folks want to have one module or Angular component. That's a little bit too granular, in my opinion, for most applications. Usually the way we think about modules is as lazy loading context. So if you want to lazy load something, then you should put it into a separate module. That's very applicable, in particular for lazy loaded routes. So that's what I would recommend. You just want to lazy load something, just put it into a separate module and use load children. So more modules or more services, which better affects performance. I'm not sure I exactly understand this question. You don't, if you have many services, like the more source code you have, the slower your application is going to be. The more source code you load actually originally, as your application loads, the the slower your application is going to be. So just reduce the number of modules and like services that you load during your initial application load time. Yeah, the interceptors. The next question is interceptors, use or not, and when. Yeah, use interceptors, especially if you have to process post or pre-process request or response. That's something very convenient. This is a very, very common concept in many different environments. If you look at backend frameworks, there you have different middlewares that process your request when the server receives it. And later on, you can process the response in a similar way. So interceptors are a really convenient concept exactly in such pipelines. This is an interesting design pattern. So if you have looked at the Gang of Four design pattern book, design patterns, elements of reusable code, the interceptor pattern is actually the chain of responsibility pattern. So it is a really popular method for processing certain identity, certain like request or response in such structured pipeline. And Rx, which operator when in HTTP requests? Yeah, still very much depends on what you would want to do. We decided to use RxJS for our HTTP module because it's very easy to throttle response requests and to also retry them. So I guess these are the most common use cases. I am particularly, so in my applications, I am cautious. I don't necessarily go full in with RxJS for HTTP all the time. I try to evaluate the scenario. If I'm building very simple application where I don't have such advanced use cases, I'm directly using fetch with promises. So that's an alternative as well. If, however, you have more advanced use cases, you like to use the expressive API of RxJS, then yeah, go ahead. And yeah, these are the most common use cases: throttling and retrying requests. Can we use function in Vue? For example, ngIf can show. Yeah, you can. You can do this. And this way, you're going to invoke not a function, but a method. So method is just a function that is attached to an object and is invoked in the object's context. If you have something like this, can show, and here we have a template. This is absolutely valid. You can also do something like this, I guess. This also works, and here you can have a function which does something. This is also valid. Probably I'll go with the first alternative. It seems like fewer indirections and slightly easier to reason about, but both are completely valid. And there wouldn't be any significant performance implications. Maybe the first one is also going to be easier to read because you see that you're invoking a method. You haven't masked it behind a getter. How to make Angular tests faster? So usually, in general, in build systems, in order to make in general, like I guess not only in build systems, in general, in order to make something faster is just to do fewer things, like fewer instances of it. Bezo is really a great example. Bezo is going to run your tests only if it detects that its inputs have changed. So a system like Bezo, that is the build system that we're using inside of Google internally, we're going to run tests only if we detect that the source files that are associated with this test have changed. So Bezo is definitely one way to make your test faster. It can run the minimum amount of tests. If you haven't changed any build files, Bezo is not going to run any tests. An alternative is to use something like Jest, where you can run tests which does something quite similar. In fact, maybe it is not as robust as Bezo, because Bezo is it could be actually. I haven't looked at Jest recently, but both Jest and Bezo can provide really great tools in order to incrementally run your tests on change. How to scalable apps? So how to build scalable apps? Yeah, just follow the Angular style guides. Follow a well-defined architectural pattern that you have learned from like community blog posts or community articles that it scales well, such as NGRX, for instance. And well, you cannot also hit the right architectural pattern from the first time. You usually do many iterations and refactorings. There is very rarely a magical bullet. You just have some very high-level vision for what your application is going to look like in the future, for how it is going to evolve, and you try to build your architecture around this. As Nir mentioned, really a lot of great practices from Solid, from the Solid's acronym with single responsibility, open, close, interface, segregation, dependency inversion, and I'm missing one, Lisco substitution. So if you're following, you can follow these good practices and you can direct your attention, apply them in the context of your application. And in general, the scalable approach for application architecture is usually very iterative. You're iterating over your application architecture until you reach something that you're satisfied with. And how to reuse build files. I'm not sure what exactly you mean by build files here. I would actually put this question here in this category. So to speed up your build, you would want to. So first of all, we're going to do some improvements in the build speed. With Ivy, we are able to build your applications faster, and we still haven't completed all the optimizations that we can do. So expect some improvements on build time. Second, if you want to improve your build time and you're building a really large application with hundreds of ng modules, I would recommend you to look at Bezo again. We have been using Bezo on the Angular monorepo. We're using it also at Google on TensorFlow and many other projects inside of Google, such as Gmail, Google Search, and many others. It really helps to build your application at scale. It requires some additional overhead because you need to learn a new build system, but you can also apply your knowledge later on for any technology out there. You can build your Angular applications with Bezo. You can also build a C++ complex embedded system, let's say, with Bezo. You can build, with Bezo, you can build pretty much most popular technologies out there. Even there are rules for Deno recently, so I would recommend you to look at Bezo. I guess with this, we completed all the questions here in the list. I'll stop sharing my screen and look at the chat. Maybe there are some more. Yeah, there are a few more questions. So what is the future of Angular elements? In general, Angular elements, they're available. You can use them today. There are some inconveniences around the build time, and we haven't decided what is the best way to proceed in order to bundle and in order to allow you to bundle and distribute your Angular elements in the most efficient way. So far, the best way to use it, to use Angular elements, is to take advantage of NGX Build Plus. Manfred Stair from community, he has a lot of great resources on how you can achieve this. Angular elements are not our top priority right now. We have a lot of other things on the list, such as making reactive forms well statically typed. So this is something that we're going to focus on first, but we're definitely thinking about elements as well. And if you have suggestions, it would be great if you can share them in the form of an issue or even design document. We will be working on an official RFC process for community. So this would allow you to provide feedback in a more structured way. So is Angular capable of tree shaking unused components from an imported module which declares them? Yeah, this could be a little bit tricky question. So in version 10, we're working on a strict mode, which assumes that your components are not performing any global side effects. And tree shaking would be simpler. In general, there is nothing in particular in Angular that is not tree shakeable. It is the tooling that makes some assumptions. And we have, in fact, a build optimizer that looks at your application's build file, your applications, not build files, but source files, and tries to make assumptions whether a particular class that you have, or like, for example, a component declaration, is pure, which means it doesn't perform any global side effects. And we're marking such declarations as pure so that we can enable later on the optimization pipeline, such as Cursor and Webpack, to remove and to drop this component. So these are things that we do right now, but with version 10, we'll be able to do them more aggressively. So to answer your questions, yeah, in general, Angular is tree shakeable, and we build it with tree shaking in mind. There is also one more question by Santosh on Bezo is too complicated to set up in Install. Is there any guidelines or docs you can suggest? Yeah, Bezo is an independent effort from the Angular team. There is an entire Bezo team that is working and maintaining this build system externally for outside of Google, and they have bezo.io. So I'll recommend you to look at bezo.io. It still might not be completely obvious because Bezo is just a tiny core, and to use Bezo for different technologies, you need to understand how to take advantage of something like plugins for Bezo. For example, there are rules or plugins for using Bezo with Angular, ones for using Bezo with TypeScript in particular, and so on and so forth. So after you understand how Bezo works on high level and you understand the syntax of its configuration language, you can look at these specific rule providers to figure out what is the way to configure them. It is quite similar to Webpack in this sense. You have Webpack, which provides a core, and you also have different Webpack plugins. So you're using these plugins from community members in order to assemble them together and build your pipeline. Yeah, it's very similar to ESLint or Babel. It's more similar to Webpack, I would say. But yeah, okay. I think I answered all questions. If you have any other questions that you want to ask, feel free to reach out to me on social media as well.
Thanks a lot, Minko. It was a great session. Thank you so much for this deep answering. So if you have any questions, now is the chance, last minute chance. Okay, we have one. How to create validator for control in reactive forms depends on another control state.
This is a little bit more specific question. I guess it will be better if you can ask me like either separately, or you can ask on Stack Overflow, and I can make sure it's we look at it. We can do. I don't think I will do well in live coding right now. Just shared the article for on-push change detection in the chat, so you can look at resources for further reference.
Yeah. So one more time, thank you so much all. Thank you, Minko. It was a great time. Second time on the Angular online meetup. So yeah, big applause from Minko. This is now the time for the big applause for this great guy. And I hope we see soon. So thank you so much all for today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.